could equal a lot more voting power for Democrats. But a new poll out today sheds more light on how these voters see themselves. Maybe you've heard this term lately. It's right there on that chart. LatinX. It's meant as a gender-inclusive term instead of Latino or Latina. But if anyone supports the new term, it seems most Hispanics do not. According to the poll, only 2% of U.S.-born Hispanics describe themselves as Latinx. 2%. But 71% say they prefer the term Hispanic. And 40% say they are bothered or offended by the term Latinx.
So interesting, folks. This is a little ditty about labels and language. Americans have a hard time pinning us down. This is by Lucita Lopez Torres Grossa, author of The Noise of Infinite Longing, a memoir. 60 million of us with Latin American and Caribbean ancestry. The first time I heard that word in the mid-2000s, I was teaching at university. It soon became clear it was no joke. Latinx was becoming an official term on elite college campuses, popular among academics, progressives, young activists, and LGBTQ groups. Ooh, all the labelers. They wanted gender-neutral terminology. In Spanish, words ending with O are masculine and those ending in A are feminine. When I heard it, my first thought was that it was in Spanish, but that it was pretentious. Many Latinos like myself see the X as odd and off-putting because it doesn't follow the traditional structure of Spanish, making it awkward and difficult to pronounce because in Spanish, few words end with two consonants. In fact, recent national surveys of Hispanics, Latinos show that the term Latinx is highly unpopular. Influential media and advocacy groups have started dropping the term or even arguing against its use to avoid offending those who dislike it. A whopping 40%. It might have been intended to be more inclusive, but it actually can feel exclusionary to everybody, to everyday people. Key phrase, everyday people. The reality is there is very little to no support for its use, and it's sort of seen as something used inside the Beltway or in Ivy League tower settings. Elitist people. You mean to tell me the elitist crowd are out of touch with people in the real world? I would never have guessed that. That decision came last week after a new survey of 800 registered voters of Latin American descent showed that only 2% describe themselves as Latinx. The poll conducted in November by a Miami-based Democratic firm also showed that 68% prefer Hispanic, 21% favor Latino, and a whopping 40% found the word Latinx offensive. That's the irony of Latinx. It's supposed to be inclusive, but erases a crucial part of Latin American identity and language and replaces it with an English word. You mean putting people under a single monolithic umbrella term that means nothing to them culturally may be perceived as offensive. The political implications are considerable. Democrats, including President Joe Biden, have been deploying the word Latinx, apparently cluelessly, believing that a gender-neutral word that was born among liberal academics and progressive activists should appeal to Latinos. It does not. Why are we using a word that is preferred by only 2% but offends as many as 40%? Offends as many as 40% of those voters we want to win. It's because they are clueless. They have no idea. They are out of touch. They are listening to activists and liberal academics and not people in the real world. Given the term's lack of wide acceptance, Latinx could thankfully be on the way out, as the data makes clear. More and more institutions are pushing back against the pressure from small vocal groups to apply a term of identity that most don't identify with. So let that be repeated. pushing back against the pressure from small vocal groups. I wonder who these people are. Liberal academics, social media activists, to apply a term of identity that most people don't identify with. Oh boy. Oh boy. Anyway, folks, this is a little ditty about labels. And while we're on the topic of labels, let's check out something that I have been actively invested in for the past few months. The invention of intersex. So we've gone from one problematic label to what is potentially another problematic label. This one is a little bit interesting. It's a little bit complicated, and I won't get too much into it. And these are not my words. I highly recommend checking out this website. Below essay is very quickly written and still very much a work in progress, but I felt it was important to share some of this information as part of Intersex Awareness Day. As someone born with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or CAIS, I, until recently, felt fairly neutral about the term intersex, as I could see its value as a political label and as a way of understanding the bodies of those of us living with complex variations of sex development. And I have found it amazing to see young activists embracing and celebrating their body differences under an intersex flag. However, the recent appropriation, misrepresentation, and even fetishization of intersex has led to me increasingly believing that the term is doing more harm than good. I am also increasingly contacted by young people, adults, and new parents that have never met anyone else with the same variation of sex development. That's another acronym, VSD. Possibly as they do not feel represented by current activism that focuses only on those who identify as intersex. Peer support can be hugely valuable. I do not mean this essay to be a criticism of people using the term intersex to describe themselves. However, I am critical of using intersex to describe babies and children who do not have a choice. Does the I need to be inclusive? On Intersex Awareness Day, I want to start with what has sadly become a controversial statement. I want to support all people born with variations or differences of sex development, DSD or VSD, and not only those who choose to identify as intersex. I want to ensure that all children born with differences in their sex or reproductive development get the family, psychological, and peer support they need to make informed choices about their health care. For this to be possible, there needs to be activism, advocacy, and academic research that is truly inclusive and centers the children and families in need of support. What even is intersex? Even the definition of intersex is contentious, poorly understood and defined, and although the lack of clear definition is often explained as being inclusive, this is frequently leading to the children most in need of support being lost in a sea of debate about gender identities or whether or not sex is binary, bimodal, or a spectrum. Every single part of the body can vary in shape, size, and function, and this can vary from slight cosmetic difference to life-threatening complications. This is no different when considering variations in the development of the reproductive system, and yet differences associated with this part of the body are increasingly politicized and presented as identity. As an identity that you can choose even without any anatomical difference. Prior to the 2006 Chicago census meeting, the term intersex usually only applied to 0.02% of the population, living with the most complex variations of sex development as detailed in the figure below. The term disorders or differences of sex development was proposed to replace the previous umbrella terms that included true hermaphrodite, male pseudohermaphrodite, female pseudohermaphrodite, and intersex. As many parents and patients had criticized the terms as being stigmatizing and out of date, as well as the automatic associations with being between the two sexes. The term DSD also allowed the inclusion of conditions such as MRKH that share many common features. Using the word disorder was criticized, including by the representatives of the AIS support group. AIS stands for Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome. The group suggested that difference, diverse, or variation of sex development may have been a better option as an umbrella term, and difference or diverse has increasingly replaced disorder in research and patient information. So differences of sex development or diverse, mainly differences of sex development. Although the term DSD is frequently used within medical research, most healthcare providers use condition-specific language when talking to patients and their families, and this is usually preferred by people living with variations of sex development, possibly as the most useful way for them to describe and understand their bodily differences. So this person has been diagnosed with CAIS, and it's best to refer to the person using CAIS as opposed to just referring to the person as intersex or even DSD, the umbrella terms. Although some adults reject any medicalization of variant sex development, and this person has used many different acronyms, especially when this is described as a disorder, many others living with variations of sex development, as well as their parents and health professionals, feel that the term intersex is also inappropriate and increases a sense of stigma and isolation. Research showing that only 10% of young people either like or use the term. Research from DSD Life also found intersex to be the most problematic term when patients were offered a choice between intersex, disorders of sex development, and differences of sex. So intersex was the most problematic terminology to use. Although the term intersex is not used by most people born with a variation of sex development, many activists and support groups have intersex as part of their name and can be critical or even hostile to anyone using DSD terminology. Although I can understand that some adults strongly identify as intersex, not creating a space for people who view things differently, for example, seeing themselves as someone with a medical condition can result in many people feeling excluded from the groups that are supposed to support and center their needs. Possibly as a way to feel that they are being inclusive, intersex groups, academics, and policymakers, again, the elites, have changed the definition of intersex to include an ever-widening group of people and increasingly imply that intersex is an identity that is open to everyone and based on an internal feeling. The most common statistic used in the media is the 1.7% from Anne Foster Sterling, a researcher, which frequently leads the statement that being intersex is as common as having red hair. However, this does not clarify that the majority of the 1.7% have late onset CAH, which does not present with atypical sex development. Basically, the people who make up this 1.7% are not truly intersexed. Point out that even polycystic ovarian syndrome have been brought under the intersex umbrella and was the most common intersex condition in the Australian research Intersex Stories and Statistics, which is frequently quoted in academic journals about intersex. Yikes. If intersex is referring to a variation in secondary sex characteristics, does this not make almost everyone in the world intersex at some level, as detailed in the figure below? This may all sound lovely and inclusive, but it is likely to prevent the children and families most in need from getting support and funding. Common sense. As well as intersex having no clear definition, the term is also frequently misunderstood to refer to gender identities. Here again, a matter of identity. This was highlighted in the recent paper by Peter Hegarty that found the term intersex was frequently understood as referring to social or gender identities. Yikes. So noted that it was more common for people without a DSD condition to identify as intersex than those with a DSD condition, who mainly see themselves as men or women with a medical condition. Self-identifying as intersex without a DSD is not uncommon, and this has a big impact on representation in research. The European Union for Fundamental Rights recently ran a large survey asking people to self-identify as intersex. The results from this survey illustrated that only 1/3 had a DSD diagnosis, 1/3 had seen a doctor, but given no diagnosis, and 1/3 had decided for themselves. Of this group, almost half of them had a diverse gender identity, including cross-dresser, polygender, and gender fluid. In other words, these people were just self-identifying and equating sex with gender. This survey was not shared with any patient groups or healthcare professionals. The above intersex expert had also produced this paper in 2015 that highlighted legal gender recognition as a priority issue for intersex people. There was little recognition of medical needs, and the only reference to psychological care seemed to conflate this with conversion therapy. This paper was criticized by people living with variations of sex development, as well as experts working in the area. But little seems to have changed, and similar self-selecting surveys are currently being used in many other areas. This includes the LGBT report produced by the UK government in 2017 that also relied on an online survey that asked people from LGBT groups to self-identify as intersex. This resulted in a response of 2,000 people identifying as intersex, 2% of the respondents. And the analysis acknowledged that this was likely not to be representative and that people were using the term intersex to mean something non-medical, possibly conflating with non-binary gender identities. In contrast, when a dedicated call for evidence open to all people with intersex DSD and designated to ensure that responses were included from people with a diagnosed DSD, along with their families and professionals working with them, there were only around 300 responses, and the analysis of this information has still not been published. So, choice of terminology. This is the one final point. Academics from the social sciences overwhelmingly use the term intersex, even though it has the potential to exclude many people born with variations of sex development who only use DSD or condition-specific language. The choice of language is often justified by the preference of activists, although sometimes misleading statistics are also used. Currently, the main issue discussed by intersex activists and academics is the banning of early genital surgery. However, this has not been accompanied by a call for experts' psychosocial services to offer family and peer support. Surgical interventions are also frequently discussed in the most crass and inaccurate ways, which has led to an increasingly simplistic and potentially stigmatizing understanding of complex issues involved, as highlighted by the recent comments by Eric Weinstein that stated, intersex babies unfairly subjected to white-coated physicians playing God with random irreversible sex-changing surgeries without a specific basis. A similar narrative is frequently presented in intersex academia, giving the lay person the impression that up to 1.7% of the population have gender forcibly assigned by surgery. So we're back to that 1.7%, which of course is misleading. Presenting intersex as just benign variations erases the very real medical and psychological needs that should be at the heart of any activism, policy, or research. This very much feels like a form of toxic positivity. These terms, academics, liberals, progressives, activists, toxic positivity, being proud of your differences and celebrating diversity can be empowering and usually rewarding. However, this should be alongside ensuring that medical and psychological needs are also met. Maybe the benign variation description is especially loved by policymakers, as it is far cheaper to provide a few flags or to add an I to the end of LGBTQ+, than providing the funding for family, psychological, and peer support. Even when the I is added, funding received is limited and less than 1% of overall funding for LGBT issues. So, basically, the point of this article is the problem with labels. The problem with labels, folks, as we see, there's a lot of misinformation, and when you use labels, it basically does not take into consideration the many, many needs of the people dumped under those labels, especially if those labels are bloated. So basically, most of these labels are not coming from the people themselves. They're not coming from members of the communities. They are coming from academics, liberal academics in the world of academia. They're coming from activists, mainly the loudest people on social media, but they are not coming up from the people. It's a top-down push from an elitist institutions and activist communities that do not take into consideration the people fitted under those umbrella terms, those that attempt to create monolithic identities that simply don't exist and often overshadow the needs of the people pushed into those categories. So instead of just applying what I call woke terminology, LatinX, and even misusing terms like intersex, treating it as an identity, maybe we should just take the time to talk to people and ask them how they see themselves. Anyway, that's all I've got for today, folks. Oh my goodness. But anyway, subscribe and let me know what your thoughts are on the problem with labels.